Hello, and welcome to Western Washington History. Eddie Bauer's parents, Jacob and Maria Katharina Ulrich Bauer, were both born in 1861 in Frank Saratov, Russia. They spoke German from being raised in a German-occupied village there. How Germans happened to be in Russia was the work of Tsarina Catherine the Great, who was a former German princess. She promised Germans religious freedom and farmland. She hoped that it would help level up the Russian people. The Germans colonized the Volga region first, to be known as the Volga Germans. Jacob and Maria married in their home village about 1881, before immigrating to the U.S. They were in Western Washington by 1890. They had 10 children total. Some of those were born in Russia. Eddie was the second to the youngest child, and he was born in 1899. He had blue eyes and brown hair. The family lived in a log cabin on Orcas Island in the San Juan Islands at this point. Eddie's dad was a hunter and a farmer. He was a caretaker of a country club, the manager of a plum orchard, and he also helped build the buildings for the 1909 Alaska-Yukon Pacific Exposition. He also taught Eddie how to catch his own food at a very young age. Eddie got his first gun at 8 years old, a 1890 Winchester .22 caliber rifle. In 1909, when Eddie was 10, the family moved to 118 37th Avenue North, Seattle. After moving, he got a job as a caddy at the Seattle Golf Club. The members there liked him and would hire him for various odd jobs. The census of 1910 shows Jacob and Katie living at the 37th Avenue address in 1910. Eddie's parents separated in 1913. Eddie and his mom stayed at the house. Eddie left school behind after the 8th grade. He found a job at Piper and Taft, a Seattle sporting goods store. He worked part-time as a stalker and an errand boy. He also learned how to tie fishing lures, how to make fishing poles, restring tennis rackets, and refinish golf clubs while he was working there. Eddie had climbed the company ladder, and by 1917, he was a department manager. In his spare time, Eddie skied, hunted, fished, and competed in golf and tennis tournaments. In 1918, Eddie registered for the draft, as he was now 18 years old. The registration shows his address at 1118 and a half 37th Avenue North, Seattle. He was living with his mom. The house was owned by Eddie's mom. They lived in the back portion and rented the other part of the home. It shows her as having no employment. By the 1920 census, Eddie was still living with his mom at the 37th Avenue address. The first business to bear the trademark name was Eddie Bauer's Tennis Shop. The Seattle Tennis Club had been going since 1890, but had grown so large that they had to move into their current building in 1919. With his dad as a co-signer, he got a $500 loan. He rented 15 feet of space for $15 a month in the back of a local hunting and fishing store named Bob Newton's Gun Shop. His new business would sell and restring tennis rackets. He had invented a vise just for restringing the rackets, which made it much faster. That year, he earned $10,000. When tennis wasn't in season, fall and winter, Eddie was out hunting and fishing. In 1920, he took the money he made from the tennis shop, and he got a $10,000 loan to match it, and opened up Eddie Bauer's Sports Shop. At this new business, he would not only repair and sell tennis rackets, but also fishing poles, trapping supplies, golfing equipment. It looks like this location was at 211 Seneca Street, Seattle. If this wasn't the first location, it was at least his location sometime in the mid-1920s and well into the 1940s. It's very difficult to find any information on the location or really much any history at all about Eddie Bauer. In 1920, he was still living with his mom. As usual, in his spare time, Eddie was always looking for new outdoor sports to try and sports to improve on. He would close the store every Labor Day and not reopen it until February, so he could enjoy the winter and fall hunting, camping, fishing, and doing all the outdoor activities he enjoyed. Eddie was out with a hunting party fall of 1927 when he met champion skeet shooter named Christine Heltborg. Everyone called her Steen. Steen owned a beauty shop in Seattle. They had their first date, which was a hunting trip, the following spring. Eddie and Steen were married in 1929. Eddie would later say what a wonderful companion she was. More stamina hiking than he had and would keep up with her in all his adventures. They had one child named Eddie Christian. Eddie and Steen would be together right up to the end of their lives. After the wedding, Steen went on to be the Washington State women's trap shooting champion 8 years running. from 1930 to 1937. Her string ended when she retired with the birth of their son Eddie Christian in 1938. The 1930 census tells us Eddie and Steen lived at 4507 57th Avenue South in Seattle. It goes on to let us know the house was worth $3,500 at that time. Believe it or not, the 1930 census also tells us that Eddie had a radio at home. Eddie always had hunting dogs, but it wasn't until 1930 that he got his first Labrador Retriever. He got the dog while in British Columbia. The lab was not used in the United States yet. It was more for the English. Eddie loved everything about the lab and never owned another breed of dog again. In 1935, Eddie patented a shuttlecock for badminton. It was superior and became the standard for the game. On a fishing trip in 1936, Eddie's wool clothing got wet and cold, and he nearly died of hypothermia before he was helped by a friend. There are many different tales of this story, but these are the facts that remain constant. He remembered his dad telling him stories of his uncle who'd been a Cossack soldier in Manchuria during the War of 1904. His dad said if it hadn't been for those down-lined coats the Cossack wore, he would have froze to death. The problem was the coats were basically a bag full of feathers that were very puffy, like wearing a fat suit around. Eddie had the idea to sew the feathers into pockets so he could use less of them to make a smaller coat because they would stay in place better. He made a couple jackets for a few friends and let them test them. They were an instant hit. He set to work producing what he called the Skyliner jacket, the first down-filled quilted jacket patented in the United States. He received his patent in 1940. He didn't stop there. He sold all forms of quilted down apparel, from vests, booties, jackets, tents, hunting jackets, sleeping bags, blankets, and more. And Steen oversaw the new women's line of sportswear. After the bombing of Pearl Harbor in 1941, Eddie is making products for the military. One of these items was a sleeping bag. According to who you ask, he either sold over 100,000 or over 200,000 sleeping bags. In 1943, the U.S. Army Air Forces asked him to design a cold-weather flight suit for them. What he designed was the B-9 flight parka and A-8 flight pants. The parka would go on to be worn by many pilots and civilians. He sold an estimated 50,000 of these jackets to the military. Every item sold to the military had a label bearing his now famous signature. Some of these pilots remembered the label when the war was over, and they looked the company up and bought one for themselves. When Eddie noticed these ex-service members and their desire for the B-9 flight jacket, he asked the government for a list of all the soldiers who received one of his products. To your narrator's amazement, they gave him the list. So armed with that list, Eddie created a mail order service in 1946 and sent a catalog to each person on the list. Eddie met William Niemi, who was Steen's friend's husband. William was into all the same outdoor activities that Eddie was into. Eddie decided to take him on as a business partner in the early 1950s. Eddie was getting worn down from all the years in business and suffered from a back injury. In 1953, 1 British and 7 Americans were going to attempt the ascent of the peak K2. K2 is the world's second highest mountain peak, but it is actually the deadliest. Approximately 1 person dies on the mountain for every 4 who reach the summit. 3 of the Americans who were going on the expedition were from Seattle. They came to Eddie and asked him if he could make them a mountain parka. He named it after the mountain range that K2 is on. He called it the Karakoram parka. This parka was later called the finest article of cold weather high altitude equipment I have ever seen by Charles Houston, one of the Americans and the expedition leader. They didn't make it to the summit though. They got pinned down by a storm for 10 days. And then Art Gilkey, an American from Colorado, got really sick. As they were hiking back down to the base camp, carrying his body, they'd set his body down for a moment, and then his body disappeared. They figure an avalanche took him, or he untied himself and threw himself over the edge because he knew he was too far gone and didn't want to burden his team by having to carry him all the way back down. In 1993, his body was discovered in the glacier at the base of the south face of K2, and he was still wearing his Eddie Bauer parka. Eddie and Steen's son Eddie, as well as William Niemi's son William, joined the business in 1960. Also that year, Eddie and Steen started Wanapum Kennels to breed and raise Labradors. In 1974, they were named Retriever Breeder of the Year. James W. Whittaker, the first American to climb Mount Everest, wore and used all Eddie Bauer products in 1963 when they did their ascent. Eddie made the Mount Everest parka just for the expedition. His gear was also used on several journeys through Antarctica. Eddie and his son, Eddie Christian, sold their interest in the company in 1968 to William F. Niemi and his son for $1.5 million. In 1971, Niemi sold the company to General Mills. In 1972, Eddie designed and patented a fishing lure called the B&B Flasher. From 1982 to 1983, Eddie co-authored 3 books for Eddie Bauer: The Eddie Bauer Guide to Backpacking, The Eddie Bauer Guide to Family Camping, and The Eddie Bauer Guide to Cross-Country Skiing. April 3rd, 1986, Steen lost her fight with pancreatic cancer and passed away. Eddie Bauer had a heart attack 15 days later in Bellingham and passed away also. Of course, as you know, the company kept going, but this is where we stop. Thank you for spending time with us again. If you liked the video, give it a thumb up. If you have any questions or comments, leave them down there and I will try to answer. Please subscribe to the channel and become a member if you can. There we post many colorized photos per day, and you can scroll through the comments and learn As you scroll through the comments, you can learn many interesting things, as well as hearing personal memories from your neighbors and people just like you. Whatever you do, remember one thing: what you do today will be history tomorrow, so make it count.